There's this country preacher who decides one Sunday that he's going to put the fear of God into his congregation. And he begins by saying, remember, everyone in this parish is going to die someday. And he notices this one guy in the front is kind of smiling. So he looks at me and says, what are you so happy about? And the guy says, I'm not from this parish. I'm just visiting my sister. When it comes to faith, that little anecdote would actually have been a pretty fair description of me about 10 or 11 years ago. And as a result, two very interesting things, coincidences, happened. Number one, I never bothered, no matter where I moved or settled in my professional journey, to join another temple wherever I was, because what was the point? I knew I wasn't going to go. And as a result of that, I had one clergyman my entire life. And he was there 10 years ago when I went back to the small town where I grew up and gave a little speech about the book Tuesdays with Morrie. And afterwards, he asked me a question that would change my life. Will you do my eulogy? To which I said, huh? Will you do my eulogy? In the beginning, that was the question. Now, while I was growing up there in that little town in New Jersey, a couple hours north, at the exact same time, another kid was growing up. His name was Henry Covington. He was one of 7 African-American children born to a man who worked as a hustler and a woman who worked as a maid. And when Henry was 5 years old, his mother suspected his father of cheating on her. And so she came after him with a shotgun, chased him out of the house, fired at him, missed him, but hit a neighbor, and was taken away to a federal penitentiary. And from that point on, young Henry, from age 5, would visit his mother on weekends and speak to her through glass. Not surprisingly, he became a petty thief and then a bigger criminal, and at 15 and 16 and 17 fell into even more crime. And by the time he was 19 years old, he was heavily into crime on the street, made a lot of enemies, and one of them fingered him in the murder of a police officer. And so for a crime he did not actually commit, Henry Covington pleaded guilty and was sent away to prison for 7 years for manslaughter. Well, when Henry got out of prison, he began to make good on that promise. He got into the drug business, and the drug business in the 70s and 80s in New York City was thriving. And very quickly he rose up. He began to sell to people on the street, and then more respectable people, and then lawyers and bankers, and even sometimes off-duty police officers. And at one point he made over $500,000 a year in the drug trade. And then Henry Covington made a fatal error. He tried some of his own product. And pretty soon he was as desperate and as hungry a junkie as any of the people he had sold to. And finally, when he was 30 years old, he was so broke, so desperate, and so addicted that the only people he could think of to rob who had either money or drugs were his own drug dealers. And this is never a good idea. He went to their apartment with a gun that didn't even have a firing pin in it. He was so whacked out. Banged on the door. They opened the door. He started waving the gun. He said, "You know what this is. You know what this is." They looked at him as if he were crazy. "You don't want to do this," they said. "You know what this is. You know what this is." Well, they gave him some drugs. He raced home, got high, smoked and snorted and sniffed, and smoked and snorted and sniffed. And then right in the middle of it, he had a thought that he probably should have had a few hours earlier. Uh-oh, they know where I live. Well, he ran outside of his place with a shotgun. He told his wife and young baby, "Hide, stay away from the windows, get down, shut off all the lights." He lay on the ground, put a row of trash cans in front of him, and lying on the ground in the street in New York City in the middle of the night, waiting for a car to come around the street, he did what many people do at moments like that. "Jesus, get me out of this. If you save me tonight, you can have me tomorrow. Just get me through this, and I'm yours." Let's leave that story there for a moment. Return to my visits with Albert Lewis whose nickname I always had was the Reb. Happiness. We talked about happiness of all subjects, such a big subject. What makes people happy? And we had this discussion in a most unusual place. It was in a hospital. Out in the hallway, a baby was crying. And he stopped and he said, "Do you hear that baby?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, did you ever notice how when infants, they come into the world, their little fists are clenched like this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "But look at me. I'm an old man, and I'm going to die soon. And how am I going to die?" And he said, "That's because when we get to the end, we realize we're not taking anything with us." So we sat there for a minute quietly, and then to break the silence, I said, "So, have we solved the secret of happiness?" "Yes, we have," he said. "Are you going to tell me?" "Yes, I will. Are you ready?" "Am I ready for the secret of happiness?" "Yes, I am definitely ready. You can go anytime you want." "Be satisfied." "That's it," I said. "Be grateful." "That's it. For all you have, for all God has given you, and for all the love you receive." Well, let me shift the story here now to Detroit, where I live. Detroit is a very beleaguered city, as you probably know. It doesn't look like this when you look out the window. And partly as a result of my visits with the Reb, I started a charity to help the homeless. And it grew very quickly because of the need. And pretty soon we were funding pretty much every homeless shelter in Detroit in some way. And part of my responsibility was to go around and find places that needed help. And I heard about this one unusual shelter that was being run out of a church. Its roof crumbling, its walls crumbling, its stained glass windows falling apart. And there was a giant hole in the roof of this church through which rain and snow literally fell in on top of the congregation. Well, I said, this is certainly a place that can use some help. So I asked to meet the pastor. And they said, just wait here. And a couple minutes later, around the corner came a very large man. He was well over 400 pounds. He was wearing a white T-shirt. He was carrying a box. He was sweating profusely from his forehead, mopping his brow. I thought he was the janitor. And then he held out his hand. And he said something to me that would also change my life forever. What he said was this: "Hello, my name is Henry Covington." And he found this old building that they were willing to give him if he wanted to try to keep it open and running. And he started something called the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries. I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries. And this was where Henry Covington worked for no salary, taking care of a mostly homeless population in a church with a hole in its roof at the bottom of the world. And so one night I went down to that 900 square foot place where Henry lived, sat on the couch where Cass had lived. It was a dilapidated place, and I made a bad remark about, I guess a life of crime pays better than a life of God. And he looked at me and he shrugged and he said, "Mitch, it doesn't matter. I'm where I'm supposed to be. Mitch, I'm probably going to hell. For the things I've done, God will be justified, and God will not be mocked." And I said, "But Henry, all the good that you do now." And he shook his head. He said, "You can't work your way into heaven, and I'm not trying to. All I'm doing now is to try to make something of my time on earth so that when I stand before God, my record isn't just all the bad stuff that I did. And then, whatever he wants with me, I accept." And that was the last time I ever doubted Henry Covington. Well, in case you're wondering, I did do the eulogy. And towards the end of those remarks, this is what I said. "After leading us through 6 different decades, Reb, you finally stepped down from this pulpit. But instead of moving to someplace warm, as many people do, you simply took a seat in the back row of this sanctuary. It was a humble act, but you could no more move to the back row than the soul could move to the back of the body. This is your house, Reb. You're in the rafters, the floorboards, the walls, the lights. You're in every echo through every hallway. How can any of us let you go? You're woven through us from birth to death. You educated us, married us, comforted us. You stood at our mileposts, our weddings, our funerals. You gave us courage when tragedy struck. And when we howled at God, you stirred the embers of our faith and reminded us, as a respected man once said, that the only whole heart is a broken heart. Look at all the broken hearts here today, Rev. Look at all the faces. My whole life I had one clergyman. Your whole life you had one congregation. How do we say goodbye to you without saying goodbye to a piece of ourselves? Where do we look for you now? We look where you have been trying, good sweet man of God, to get us to look all along. We look up. Well, in the weeks and months that followed, I got more involved with the church, and Henry eventually dubbed me the first official Jewish member of the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries Church. And eventually, I wrote a book about the experience between these two men that you have on your table. And when the book came out, a funny thing began to happen. Envelopes began to arrive at the church. Letters. Inside would be $5 or $10. And the letters all essentially said the same thing. Fix your roof. I don't have a lot of money, but fix your roof. Church shouldn't have a hole in its roof. Fix your roof. Until enough of these letters came from around the world, literally from around the world, that one Monday, just before Christmas, a big truck pulled up to the corner of that church. And the homeless population and all the congregants and Henry and everyone were waiting on the corner, and they began to unload boxes of shingles and handed them in a human line up a ladder to the roof, and then cheered and sang, "Amen, amen, amen," as men on top of the roof began to fix this hole that had been there for over 10 years. And today, if you go to the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministry Church, as you are more than welcome to do if you ever stop in Detroit, and you walk inside the church and you stand right where that hole used to be in the sanctuary, and you look up, you will see a plaque in the ceiling with the names of every single individual from around the world who gave even 50 cents to help fix that roof. Because, let's face it, when you're in a church and you look up, you should see something inspiring, right? And what could be more inspiring than proof that people of all races, all religions, all faiths, all nationalities can come together to fix each other's holes when they need to. By the way, I did open that file on God. There inside that file were hundreds of pages of anecdotes, stories, biblical quotations, notes written in the Reb's handwriting, all about God. You can't fit God in a file. If you could, everyone would have one on his shelf. It's the choosing to believe in those things that don't fit inside a file. It's the choosing to believe in something bigger than yourself. It's the choosing to believe that we're here for a larger purpose than just worm food at the end. It's the choosing to believe that there's something divine inside every one of us in this room and in this town and on this planet that connects all of us. Some spark of humanity, some piece of God that's inside everybody that connects us all, that you can't see and you can't prove, but you just know it's there. It's the choosing to believe that we have a purpose and a reason to trust one another and a reason to work with one another, a reason to try to make the world better. It's the choosing to believe that, not having it laid out in front of you, but choosing to believe that. That is the crazy, maddening, sometimes disappointing, but ultimately, in the end, satisfying journey that we call faith. Faith in God, faith in one another, faith in humanity. In the beginning, there was a question: will you do my eulogy? In the end, that question and all the other questions gets answered. I believe that, like the Reb, God sings, and all of us down here hum along. And there are many melodies, many, many melodies, but it's all one song. One same beautiful human song.